So there's a lot of people theorizing right now about why Kamala Harris lost to Donald Trump. But to be clear, nobody really knows for sure. I mean, you can come away with theories and hypothesize about why she lost. You can make deductions based on the data. But at the end of the day, it's really hard to make sense of a nonsensical outcome. The country fell to fascism, and regardless of how we try to explain how that happened, the fact that it happened in and of itself is baffling, genuinely so. So nobody really knows. But I do think that we can draw some conclusions, and we could discuss what potentially did contribute to this outcome. And I'm going to do that in this video. But first, I'm going to kind of piggyback off of what one person says, and that person is Bernie Sanders, who's going to speak to one dimension, who's going to speak to one reason why Kamala didn't win. And he's not necessarily going to talk too much about Kamala specifically and what she did and didn't do. Rather, he is going to speak to the underlying issues with the Democratic Party itself to explain how what they're doing just isn't working. They lost to Trump twice, and I think that some introspection is in order. Now, what he says here, it does ruffle some feathers. It ruffles quite a bit of feathers. So I'm going to read his response to you, followed by the DNC chair's rebuttal, and then I'm going to share my thoughts, because as you can expect, I have a lot to say. I haven't talked yet about this much, so you're going to get my pure, unadulterated thoughts on this. But first, let's get to Bernie Sanders. So he released a statement on Twitter, which I'll read in its entirety, because what he says here is, I think, really important. Quote, "It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them. First, it was the white working class, and now it is Latino and black voters as well. While the Democratic leadership defends the status quo, the American people are angry and want change. And they're right. Today, while the very rich are doing phenomenally well, 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and we have more income and wealth inequality than ever before. Unbelievably, real inflation accounted for weekly wages for the average American worker are actually lower now than they were 50 years ago. Today, despite an explosion in technology and worker productivity, many young people will have a worse standard of living than their parents, and many of them worry that artificial intelligence and robotics will make a bad situation even worse. Today, despite spending for more per capita than other countries, we remain the only wealthy nation not to guarantee healthcare to all as a human right, and we pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. We alone, among major countries, cannot guarantee paid family and medical leave. Today, despite strong opposition from a majority of Americans, we continue to spend billions funding the extremist Netanyahu government's all-out war against the Palestinian people, which has led to the horrific humanitarian disaster of mass malnutrition and the starvation of thousands of children. Will the big money interests and well-paid consultants who control the Democratic Party learn any real lessons from this disastrous campaign? Will they understand the pain and political alienation that tens of millions of Americans are experiencing? Do they have any ideas as to how we can take on the increasingly powerful oligarchy, which has so much economic and political power? Probably not. And I think he hit the nail on the head. And to add to his point, if you look to the Rust Belt states, just the blue wall that fell this time, millions of Americans in these states lost their health insurance under Joe Biden. Joe Biden did really well in 2022. The Democratic Party did well when there were pandemic-era protections in place. Now, you can make promises, but at the end of the day, if people don't feel as if they're doing better, then they're going to punish the party who's in power. That's an oversimplification, but it's an explanation that I think contributed to this outcome. And what's really sad is that I don't think any of us expect the Democratic Party to actually change a damn thing. If anything, most of us are expecting them to shift even further to the right and become even more xenophobic in order to make sure that they don't lose any more Republicans that they think they've won over. And some are even now flirting with the idea of becoming transphobic. This happened after Texas Democrat Colin Allred threw trans people under the bus, and now more Democrats are doing the same thing. For example, Democrat Seth Moulton said that identity politics hurts Democrats. Quote, "I have 2 little girls. I don't want them getting run over on a playing field by a male or formerly male athlete. But as a Democrat, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that." Representative Tom Suozzi says Democrats have to stop pandering to the far left, he adds. "I don't want to discriminate against anybody, but I don't think biological boys should be playing in girls' sports." In other words, they're doing the meme. You know the meme about how whenever Democrats lose an election, they look themselves in the mirror and say, we've got to get more racist. They're doing that. These dumbass dipshits see the exclusionary brand of Trumpian politics, and rather than asking themselves how to counter it more effectively, they're warming up to the prospect of potentially embracing it because they think that that's going to help them win over those fascists. I mean, they already did this on immigration. We already hear the way that they talk about Palestinians as if they're not even human beings. And some are already signaling a shift on trans issues. They are literally learning the opposite lesson that they should be learning, which isn't surprising because it's exactly what the fuck they did after they lost in 2016. But let's hear from lobbyist turned DNC Chair Jaime Harrison, who was elevated to a leadership position in the Democratic Party after losing his Senate race against Lindsey Graham after raising millions and millions of dollars. And, after the result of this election, he has to resign in shame. But he thinks he knows what to do to win after losing multiple times now. So he responded to Bernie Sanders saying, "This is straight up BS. Biden was the most pro-worker president of my lifetime, saved union pensions, created millions of good-paying jobs, and even marched in a picket line. And some of MVP's plans would have fundamentally transformed the quality of life and closed the racial wealth gap for working people across this country. From the child tax credits to $25,000 for a down payment for a house to Medicare covering the cost of senior health care in their homes. There are a lot of post-election takes, and this one ain't a good one." Okay, he's still not getting it. I'll admit Joe Biden was better for unions and labor, but union membership still fell. And those policies that Kamala was promising, they were very good. But Americans want systemic change. It's the system itself that's the problem. And they refuse to speak to that. Making tweaks around the edges is better than nothing, I suppose. But the fundamental problem is the system, and neither Joe Biden nor Kamala Harris had any intention on uprooting that system. Bernie Sanders did in 2016, hence why he was popular, because he was talking about a political revolution. The goal was to completely disempower elites and redistribute wealth in a significant way. Take healthcare, for example. Bernie Sanders called for Medicare for all. This means the total dismantling of our current healthcare system as it stands. It means abolishing private insurance companies and moving towards a fully decommodified healthcare system where care is free at the point of service to all of us. This is what the Democratic Party's base has wanted for decades. And it's what Americans want. There was a point in time where healthcare in 2018 became the #1 issue in the country over the economy. This was before inflation, but nonetheless, still really important. Now, around the same time, the polls were showing that 70% of Americans supported Medicare for all. But then the Democratic Party saw all this momentum for a life-changing policy, and they fucking killed it. Why? Because they chose their donors over us. When the 2020 Democratic Party primary kicked off, the health insurance industry bet on Biden in its war against Medicare for all, and that paid off. He even threatened to veto Medicare for all if he was elected. And even though he was antagonistic to an incredibly popular policy that his own base has wanted for decades, he did still support a public option. But after he was elected, we never heard about a public option. Never said a single thing about a public option. Even that was apparently off the table. Then we come to the Harris campaign, where she seemingly didn't even support a public option. But she did propose her Medicare expansion, which would have covered long-term care for seniors and vision as well as dental. Now, that policy would be incredible. But notice how far we've gotten away from Medicare for all, which is what really excited the base. Understand how much more narrow the appeal of that policy is compared to even a public option. I would still love to see it, but I'm a millennial, and that policy isn't going to benefit me for several decades. Now, I'd be motivated to vote for something positive even if it doesn't affect me personally, but others aren't going to do that. Most voters don't vote unless they think there's something that is going to benefit them specifically and immediately. And people want to know what you're going to do for them right now. And these comparatively milquetoast promises that we don't even expect you to keep, by the way, are not going to do enough to get people off of their asses to vote for you. Because even if the proposal is objectively good, understand that it's still a tweak to the system that we all hate, as opposed to actually uprooting the system. We want to tear the fucking system apart, and they don't want to do that. But healthcare is just one example. Even when a Democrat proposes something good, like the PRO Act or Voting Rights Act or H.R. 1, which would have gotten money out of politics to an extent, we still don't expect them to fight. Minimum wage. I mean, there was the parliamentarian. There's always an excuse. The filibuster, Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema. And don't get me wrong. I understand the reality of institutional limitations and obstructionists and the Supreme Court. I get it. But a lot of us get the sense that Democrats don't really even support these policies, and they just support them as a form of lip service during elections to get us mildly interested. Just in case voting against a fascist isn't enough. But hell, I'll take lip service when the alternative is Donald Trump. It works for me. But not this time. It wasn't enough. And Democrats aren't even good at lip service, right? Take Gaza, for example. I don't know if, even if she did better on this issue, she would have won, because there's a lot of issues here. But for more than a year, we've been witnessing a Holocaust in Gaza. And people like myself have been screaming at the top of our lungs to get Biden to stop supporting this. And at every step of the way, the Democratic Party has told us to go fuck ourselves. When we called for a ceasefire, Biden's press secretary called us repugnant. When Biden finally co-opted the word ceasefire, which was repugnant, but he started using that, he wouldn't actually enforce it by doing an arms embargo. This is what I mean when I say that Democrats aren't even good at lip service. They can't even fake it to make it. And during the campaign, Harris had the opportunity to break from Biden here and win back some of those voters that were going to stay home because of her policy here. Would it have made the difference? Probably not. But when she was given the opportunity to change course, when she was confronted by pro-Palestinian protesters in Michigan, do you want to know what she said? She looked them in the eyes and she condescendingly said, "I'm speaking." And then liberals put that on a shirt with her face on it. This is the problem. They wouldn't even give a Palestinian American 5 minutes at the DNC. And by the end of the campaign, they deployed Richie Torres and Bill Clinton to Michigan to give one last fuck you to people who cared about the genocide. The utter contempt that this party has for its own base is truly astonishing to me. But the Democratic Party, they spit in our faces again and again and again because they've deluded us into thinking that they don't actually need us to win. And this is one of many reasons why they lost twice to Donald Trump now. They think that they can win over enough moderate Republicans to make up for the members of their own base that they're losing, that are disillusioned and apathetic, that don't come out to vote. This was Hillary Clinton's strategy in 2016, and she lost. Chuck Schumer said, for every progressive they lose, they're going to pick up a suburban person. That didn't work. And in 2024, Kamala almost exclusively pandered to Republicans in the final month of her campaign. She held rallies with Liz Cheney. And let's look at how that strategy played out. As Professor Benanav of Cornell points out, less registered Republicans voted for Harris in 2024 than they did in 2020. Look at that. Look at that fucking strategy payoff there. It was a catastrophic failure. But after her DNC speech, when I sounded the alarm, some of you came into my comment section telling me I was wrong. And that speech wasn't for people like me. You were tweeting at me saying, "Hey, Mike, understand that she has to do this." Did she? Because turns out it didn't work. And this is not me saying, "I told you so." This is me saying that speech was for me. And it was for you. Who else would it have been for? She's not going to win over the Republican Party's base. She needs to get her base off their asses. And saying I'm Republican light isn't going to enthuse any of us. And saying I'm Republican light isn't going to get Republicans to go for the diet Republican over the real thing, especially when they're proposing what they've all wanted for a while, actual fascism. This is not me just speculating. This is borne out in the data. If you look to Europe, when liberal parties shift to the right on issues like immigration, they don't win over conservatives, but they risk losing their own base. For decades, we've known that this has been a losing strategy. And whenever we see it again and again and again, when people like me sound the alarm, when people like Hassan sound the alarm, we're told to shut the fuck up, and we're told to accept that this has to be done because this is the way that it's always been done. It's wrong. You were wrong if you were pushing this strategy. Full stop. And you all need to accept the reality that we live in a highly polarized political environment. Elections aren't about persuasion. They are about mobilization. You need your base to win. It's politics 101. So stop tweeting at me, telling me that this Bill Clinton-ass strategy of triangulation is how Democrats win, because it is a demonstrable fucking failure. But here's the problem. Democrats don't want to win, but we can choose to not parrot their bullshit-ass talking points about strategies that have failed again and again and again. They don't want to win, though. They don't want to win with their base. They'd rather lose than win with their base because that would require them to give us what we want, which is a change to the system. They can't speak to that because they represent the system. They are the establishment, part of it at least. And they know we hate the establishment and we want to burn this fucking system to the ground, but they're entrenched within that system and can't separate themselves from it. And therein lies the problem. That's why the Democratic Party will never change. It is fundamentally at odds with its own base, and they can't change because to be anti-establishment means to be an entirely different party. And they had the chance to turn this around and embrace populism, but do you want to know what they did? They snuffed out those movements both times. In 2016, Bernie Sanders formed a movement out of nowhere, and my entire generation, after being horrified by Obama's drone war, after being so disillusioned with him, we finally thought this was our moment to change the system that kept all of us down after Obama failed us. But the DNC sabotaged Bernie Sanders. They limited debates and attacked Bernie on MSNBC and told us that a socialist could never win and Hillary was electable. The DNC chair had to resign in disgrace after colluding with Clinton to crush the insurgent movement that was organically materializing within their party. Then they had another chance. In 2020, the same losers did everything they could to undermine him, and they were, quote, agonizing over his momentum rather than understanding that this was their ticket to victory. This was it. But then Democratic Party elites like Obama had made phone calls to Buttigieg and Klobuchar and told them to drop out and endorse Biden to stop Bernie. And they did that, and that was the final nail in the coffin of Bernie Sanders and his movement. And now the chickens are coming home to roost for them. Now young people, more and more, are not coming back to the Democratic Party. As Jordan Sheridan points out, combined millennial Gen Z turnout age 18 to 44 declined by 7% from 2016, 44% of voters, to 2024, 37% of voters. This was age group Bernie Sanders won and galvanized, but Dems and media took him out by the knees. He continues in 2020, 18 to 44. 40% of voters. That's a 4-point turnout drop versus 2016. 18 to 29. 17% of voters. 2-point turnout drop by 2016. Lots of young voters felt Dems came together to stop Bernie from winning the primary. And ever since this party that my generation identified with crushed our movement and took away our opportunity to have a chance at a better future, none of us have felt at home with the Democratic Party. Leftists and socialists feel like we're unwanted. We feel like we're more of a nuisance to the party because, quite frankly, we are. We don't like this system, and we want an anti-establishment party that vows to tear down the system, but that's antithetical to everything that they stand for. And on top of that, we try to go along to get along. We try to put aside our differences and vote for the Democratic Party anyway, because we know that fascism is a real threat to a lot of us. But not a lot of people vote solely based on the threat of fascism. They think, well, you know what? The system's already bad, so what's fascism going to do to me? I'm already suffering. It doesn't matter. Maybe that'll be a quick death as opposed to the slow death with neoliberalism. And I need you to understand, this isn't me crying over spilt milk. This is what we feel like was our ticket to a completely different timeline. Bernie Sanders probably would have won in 2016, and he would have been able to transform the Democratic Party in the same way Trump transformed the Republican Party. And his successor could have carried out that same agenda, could have carried the torch to victory again in 2024. But now we're in the darkest timeline because they've snuffed out that populist movement that emerged within their party. Now, to be clear, maybe it wouldn't have turned out that way. Maybe Bernie would have lost. But that real feeling of disillusionment with the Democratic Party from young people, from my generation, that's real. And we felt like you took away that future from us. You took away our last chance to save the planet. And they have to grapple with that. A lot of people are staying home. People in my generation, they don't vote for the Democratic Party enthusiastically. They vote for the Democratic Party out of necessity because they don't want fascism. But voting out of necessity, it's not going to win you the day every time. It did in 2020, but it didn't in 2016 and 2024. And Bernie is just the tip of the iceberg. See, fascism is on the rise around the globe, and the antidote to fascism is leftist populism, because a leftist populist can speak to the frustration with the system better than a fascist can. It's why Lula won in Brazil after Bolsonaro. It's why AMLO and Sheinbaum won in Mexico. Fundamentally changing the system is the Democratic Party's ticket to victory. This is an anti-establishment era, globally speaking. And the Democratic Party's refusal to address the systemic issues that have hollowed out the middle class is why Trump won twice. Now, don't get me wrong, Democrats can still win elections by not being populist. Biden did in 2020. But that was more of an anti-incumbency election in the same way that this election was an anti-incumbency election. But I mean, you got to change the party dynamic if you want to win, and they don't. So they're not winning long term. And just to be clear, this isn't a magic bullet. Because Bernie Sanders' movement catalyzed progressive candidates across the country. I brought on hundreds of them on this channel, potentially. Over 100 at a minimum. I brought them on, and they lost. Now, you know, a lot of that is due to them not taking corporate money and not having name recognition. So I think that you have to accept that a lot of Americans are too stupid to understand what's best for them, and they're too lazy to research the candidates who actually do want to change the system they hate so much. So, you know, it's not a guarantee that you win as a populist, but does it increase your chances? Yes, I believe it does. You have to speak to the grievances that we have with the system because the system has failed us. Late-stage capitalism is killing all of us. You don't speak to that, you're only going to have short-term victories. But putting aside the external factors such as inflation and the economy, every single Democratic victory is always going to hinge on their ability to turn out their base. If the base shows up, they win. If the base stays home, they lose. And I want to show you what I mean by that. So in 2020, 81 million people voted for Joe Biden and 74 million people voted for Trump. Compare that to 2024, where 73 million people showed up to vote for Donald Trump. Might be 74 by the time all the votes are counted, but 68 million voted for Harris. In other words, the Republican base largely showed up for Trump, but the Democratic Party's base did not show up for Harris. And this was, I think, in part because Harris made a gamble. She assumed that the people that showed up for Biden in 2020 would definitely show up for her again. And since she had that belief, she tried to run up the score by expanding the coalition to bring in Republicans like Liz Cheney and people who support Liz Cheney, all three of them that exist in the country. But as we've now learned, again, that strategy simply did not work. Now, part of the problem, to be fair to Harris, is that she had 100 days to run a campaign. That is very difficult. So Biden kind of crippled her. He kneecapped her. Because had he dropped out sooner or chosen to not run again, the Democratic nominee would have had more time to build up name recognition and effectively make their case. But nonetheless, her strategy did not contribute to her win at all. If anything, it was counterproductive. Trump didn't win so much as Democrats lost this election because turnout was low and the base didn't show up. Democrats have got to shore up support from their base every election. Go for the non-voters. Go for the young people. Bring out people that are disillusioned with the system. That's how you win. But as I've said before, They won't do that because they don't want to uproot the system. And so long as they refuse to do that, we're going to be locked into this cycle where we'll only be lucky, if enough people come out after Republicans fuck up enough, after people are horrified by Republican policies, and, if that happens. I think that Democrats have made some improvements with regard to the NLRB and FTC. Biden did some things. I'm not taking that away from him, but there's this weird blend of neoliberalism with more working class friendly policies than before, but you can't really have it both ways. One or the other has got to win out. And until you fundamentally change people's lives and they feel it in their wallets, it's just not going to work. But not being the Republican just isn't good enough. They've got to speak directly to this anti-establishment fervor in the same way that Bernie Sanders did, but they won't. And in 4 years, if we're lucky enough to have another election, which I'm not sure, honestly, they'll probably nominate someone even more entrenched in the system because they won't learn their lesson because they don't want to. So don't be surprised if we get a fucking Mark Cuban or Joe Manchin in 4 years, because that's what the Democratic Party does. That's assuming, again, we get another election. I don't know. But with that being said, I'm not going to absolve voters of culpability here as well, because they are also to blame. And sure, you shouldn't really blame voters, but I am going to do that. We talked a lot about the Democratic Party's fuck-ups, and I think that in large part, that did contribute to the scenario that we're in currently. But voters also play a role, and Democrats failed, yes, to meet voters where they were and try to get around the dumb fuckery that prevents us from thinking clearly as a country, but they didn't. But it's also true that voters are just stupid. Don't get me wrong. I think understanding why desperation leads to fascism is important, because if you learn how people operate, that's how you can address it. And I wholeheartedly believe that a populist, unapologetically left-wing Democratic Party could have defeated an authoritarian fascist like Donald Trump. But that doesn't change the reality that millions of Americans are deeply stupid, and they just voted for Hitler too, in part because they hope that eggs and gas will be 50 cents cheaper or something. I mean, millions of people voted for fascism for economic reasons, which is, they're going to find out real soon that that's not going to benefit them. But more alarming than that, millions more voted for Hitler too because he's Hitler too. That was the selling point. They liked it. And unlike in 2016, they now know what they got us all into. So I'm not going to pretend like these people aren't dumb and cruel. They are. We know they are firsthand. They're our family members and our coworkers. And we know that they derive pleasure from the suffering of fellow Americans because they've told us that they do. Some of their little dicks probably got hard for the first time in years after getting a new crop of compilations of woke SJWs crying over the election results. Cruelty to them is their life fuel. They love it. They're fundamentally bad people that can't ever be won over regardless of how xenophobic or transphobic the Democratic Party becomes. And Democrats need to understand that reality. Republicans have monopolized discourse in America. The top 10 election day streamers were all conservatives, with the exception of Hassan Piker. He's the one person that was not a fascist that had the biggest audience. And, putting that aside, the biggest influencers in the country are the red pill, manosphere fascists who pander to neo-Nazis or who are neo-Nazis themselves. Those of us on the left, we just cannot compete with those people. It's not even close. Decades of defunding public education and nonstop brainwashing has culminated in this moment. It's paid off. Celebrities can't counter the hold that these people have on young men and conservatives. The only way to defeat them is to build a multiracial, multi-generational coalition of working class people like the one Bernie Sanders built in 2016 that the Democratic Party squashed out. Now, that doesn't mean that racism and fascism would have went away if Bernie Sanders won, because I think that's delusional, and I'm not a class reductionist. This will still be a deeply racist, deeply sexist, and deeply xenophobic country, regardless of what we do. But the problem is that it's going to get worse if people feel like they've been failed by the system and they begin to actually believe that immigrants and trans people and DEI is the cause of their problems and not capitalism. And as things continue to get worse, more and more people will become fascist. I'm not justifying it, but I'm explaining why this happens. Desperation is no excuse to be a piece of shit, by the way. But we need to be cognizant of this correlation and try to find a way to reach these people if it's not already too late. But look, I don't think most Americans are good people. I don't. Some of you may take issue with that, but I don't think they're good people. Most of us are bad people in this country. The stereotypes about us, if you're an international viewer, are true. We are miserable people. We're terrible people. We're rude. We're loud. We're stupid. I think it's undeniably true. You all think it. I'm just saying it. That doesn't mean, though, that we're all bad. But we need to stop deluding ourselves into thinking that there's going to be some mass awakening where we all come together one day and arrive at some utopian version of America. That's never going to happen ever. Either the good people will come together to defeat the bad people, and there are more of them than there are of us, or the bad people will come together to defeat the good people. We have irreconcilable differences in this country, and one of two sides is going to win. Currently, the bad people are winning, and the good people are losing. It's that simple. And this Trump victory is probably going to solidify their hold over us for the rest of our lives and generations to come. So it's probably too late to change things, if I'm being honest, because our leaders have failed us and the system predictably overpowered us. So the best we can do as individuals is just fucking survive and try to help marginalized and vulnerable people survive as things get worse. It's bleak, but that's where we're at. I think it's too late to fix the country, so we've just got to survive.